Hey everybody, welcome back to Cardboard Commander. My name is Jerry, and today we're going to continue with learning the rules for Enemy Action Kharkov. Again, I am playing the Soviet Solo Edition for the 10 War Game Challenge, but everyone says to learn the two-player rules and then go to the solo rules, so that's what we're doing. Yesterday, we left off when we went over all the components. Basically, we looked at the map, we looked at the pieces, the counters, we looked at the chits, we looked at the cards and all the information counters and kind of went through that. And then we kind of went through the sequence of play. So now we got all the things needed to how to draw hands and do all that. So now we saw how to activate formation. So now we're going to start with movement. So today we're going to go over movement and a few other things, and then we'll see how far this goes. So thanks again for those who are watching. I've had some great feedback, so I really do appreciate it. So let's go ahead and jump into this. So movement. Upon playing a card to activate units, the player may move all, some, or none of his just activated units. Each unit is moved individually through one or more contiguous hexes up to the limit of the unit's movement allowance. For each hex entered, the unit pays one or more movement points. The movement point cost to enter a hex varies with the type of unit moving, example, infantry or mechanized, the terrain in the hex being entered, and the presence of a river along the intervening hex sides, as specified in the terrain effects chart. There are some basic restrictions. A unit may not exceed its movement allowance when moving. A unit with insufficient movement points to enter a hex may not do so. Exception. A unit may always move at least one hex as long as the move is otherwise allowed. The movement of one unit must be completed before the next is begun. Any movement points left unused by the unit are lost. They are not saved for future activation or impulse. Movement points may not be transferred between units. Zones of or effects of other units on movements. Zone of control effects. The movement of units is affected by enemy units and their zones of control. A unit must pay one movement point to leave an enemy controlled hex, in addition to the cost of terrain in the hex being entered. A unit can't move directly from one enemy controlled hex to an adjacent enemy controlled hex. However, see German Mappage Movement 7.7 and Withdrawal for additional changes. There is no additional cost to enter the enemy-controlled hex, but the unit must stop moving upon doing so. Hex entry restrictions. A unit can't enter an enemy-occupied hex. A unit may move or advance into an unoccupied enemy town or center hex, but must stop upon doing so. Friendly units have no effect on the movement of other friendly units. So examples of zone of control effects on movement. Unit A, which is right here, is adjacent to an enemy unit and shows movement options in the areas he can't go into. Note that moving out of his enemy zone of control costs one movement factor, in addition to the cost of the train to be entered. So if you're looking at A right here, he can't go down here toward this unit because he'd be leaving a zone of control, entering a zone of control. He'd be doing the same thing if he tried to go over here. However, if he went back toward number 2, he could do that, or he could bounce out of the zone of control and then go back into the zone of control. So he's got to go to one free hex and then back in the zone of control. Moving on roads. A unit entering a hex throughout a connecting road hex side, including a bridge, pays one movement point to enter the hex, regardless of the terrain in the hex. Roads also provide mechanized units with a strategic movement bonus. So examples of movement. So if we look at A, the third tank up here for the Russians, the armored unit moves 6 hexes, expending 6 movement points by using the road at a cost of 1 MP per hex entered, regardless of the terrain. So as long as he stays on the road, he can go to there, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. He can wind up right here. He stayed on the road the entire time. B, the infantry unit pays 1 movement point per hex, except 2 MPs for woods and marsh and +1 for crossing the Donets. So if you look at B, It's going to cost 2 to go into this forest space. It's going to cost 2 to go across the river for 4 movement points, and that's all he has. C. The armored unit moves 4 hexes, expending 6 movement points. Crossing the Donitz adds +2. Alternately, it could have moved south of the Donitz by first crossing the bridge at Ism and the stream. I know I mispronounced that. So if you look at C, there's a couple options, right? So it's going to cost 1 to come into here, 2 there, 3, 4, 5 across this stream, and 6 into there. Or he can go 3 across the stream, right? So it's 1 open, across the stream is 3, 4, 5, 6. So there's other ways to do things like that. Examples of strategic movement. So a Soviet infantry unit has a strategic movement allowance of 6. So this is we're looking at A right here. So so they came up with 6 movement points because you get 4 movement points for basic and then 2 for strategic. So that bumps that to 6. It cannot move to 0806 because strategic movement adjacent to an enemy unit is not allowed. So again, unit starts here, has to go into the forest for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It can't go here because that would be next to another enemy unit into a zone of control. The German armor unit does not gain movement points like infantry. Its strategic movement bonus is to pay only half MP for movement along roads. It expends all 6 to reach the designation. So unlike infantry that just adds 2 to the movement value, you only have to pay a half a point as long as you're on a road for armor. So as you can see here, half a point 1, half a point 2, because they're on the road in the forest, half a point 3, then they're going off the road, so it's going to cost 4 and 5. Or 4, they can't go there, right? So that's pretty self-explanatory. And then you've got C. The Soviet armor unit also uses strategic movement bonus of 1/2 movement points per road. It expends 3 of its 6 movement points to reach hex 0410. It has 3 movement points remaining, but cannot enter Belgorod because strategic movement is not allowed into enemy VP hexes. The unit can't enter hex 413 because Soviet units can't use strategic movement to go further west than the westernmost unit on their front. So when we look at C, it's going to be a half a movement point because they're using strategic on the road, right? I'm sorry, I was looking at this down here for B. Now we're looking at C. So I kind of got you confused there. But you see them here. This is being recorded. You should be able to pause it and go from there. But just remember, strategic movement for infantry, you just add 2 to the movement factor. And for armor, it's a half a point on the road. Crossing river and hex size. Unbridged river hex size. Hex sides. Units moving across an unbridged river must spend movement points to cross the hex side in addition to the cost to enter the hex, as noted on the terrain effects chart. The hex sides costs vary depending on the type of unit, mechanized or non-mechanized, and the type of river, minor river, Donitz, or the Napier, and are higher if the ground condition is like mud. A unit must spend its entire movement allowance to cross an unbridged Depner. Somebody tell me how to say that. DNIEPR, river hexide. That is, the unit must start its move in a hex bordering the river hexide to be crossed and end its move upon entering the adjacent hexide. So basically, can you just go from one hexide across the river to the next hexide? Bridge river hexides. A river hexide crossed by a road is considered bridge. A unit crossing a river hexide via a road disregards movement penalties for the river. Stacking units. More than one friendly unit may occupy a hex. This is called stacking. The maximum number of units that may occupy a hex is 3 units or 6 steps. Remember, we talked about that earlier. Stacking limits must be observed at all time, except during the movement portion of an activation and during retreat or advance after combat. That is, units may move through other units in violation of stacking limits, but when all the movement in the impulse is complete, or when all retreats and advances after combat are complete, stacking limits are enforced. So you can go through a hex and overstack, But at the end of that phase, you have to be back into the stacking limits. Strategic movement bonus. Starting on game turn 2, an active supplied unit may move with the strategic movement bonus within the following restrictions. A unit can't start its move adjacent to an enemy occupied hex. The unit can't move adjacent to an enemy occupied hex during the activation. The unit can't enter an enemy town or city hex during the activation. Strategic movement is not allowed in light mud conditions. So, strategic movement bonuses, and we talked about this just a minute ago. Armor, armored cavalry, and mechanized infantry. Movement cost to enter a hex through connected road hex sides is 1/2 movement point instead of 1 movement point. When entering a hex not connected by a road, the normal movement costs are applied. So remember, it's only on road that can be used. Infantry and cavalry, movement allowance is increased by 2 for those units. Soviet strategic movement restrictions. Soviet units conducting strategic movement are subject to additional restrictions throughout this activation. On turn 5 plus, the unit can start its move in a hex outside Soviet support. The unit can't enter an empty map edge VP hex, and the unit can't enter a hex further west than the westernmost unit in its army, or further south than the southernmost unit in its army. So that's going to be depending on where they're at on the map. We'll have to run into that when we get into the game. So Soviet front boundaries. So that's all this stuff over here. Soviet units are restricted in where they can be deployed and move on the map, depending on the front to which the unit belongs. Movement of German units is not restricted by boundary lines. Boundary lines for the 2 Soviet fronts are printed on the map. A Soviet reserve unit must be deployed within its front boundaries. No Soviet unit may move outside of its front boundary. The boundaries of the 2 fronts overlap. Units of both fronts may operate in the overlapping area. So that's this area right here, up in the upper right. It's kind of 2 different colors. A Soviet Union may attack across its front boundary, but can't advance across the boundary. A unit may retreat across a front boundary only if that is the only possible route of retreat for that unit. A unit across its front boundary may move only if each hex entered is across or closer to the unit's front boundary line. German map edges. A German unit starting its move in a German map edge hex can move 1 hex to an adjacent German map edge, regardless of enemy zones of control. If the hex entered is in an enemy zone of control, the unit's move ends in that hex. So note, imagine the German unit moving into an off-map hex and back onto the map into an adjacent hex. So zones of control. Every non-isolated unit exerts control into the 6 adjacent hexes. So basically the 1 hex, the 6 hexes around it. Control inhibits enemy movement, retreat, advance, and tracing of enemy supply. Units that are isolated do not exert control. Zones of control extend across hex sides and into hexes of all terrain types, including across blocked Dampier River hex sides. Effects of control. So a unit must stop movement upon entering the enemy-controlled hex and cannot move further that activation. A unit that starts its move in an enemy-controlled hex must pay an additional movement point to exit that hex and may not move directly into an enemy-controlled hex. The presence of other friendly units in an adjacent hex does not negate this effect. So just because there's a friendly unit in that hex, if it's next to a German unit, you still can't move there. Friendly supply may be traced from an enemy-controlled hex, but may not be traced through an enemy-controlled hex unless that hex is occupied for a friendly unit. So if there's a Soviet Union in a zone of control of an enemy unit, it can still trace supply through that hex. A unit may retreat into an enemy-controlled hex within the retreat priorities of 9.7 if the hex is occupied by a friendly supplied unit and there is no penalty. If the hex is unoccupied or occupied only by a friendly unsupplied unit, the retreating unit or stack must lose a step. A unit may ignore enemy control zones of control if advancing one hex. If advancing a second hex, the unit can advance from one enemy-controlled hex to another enemy-controlled hex. Exception, a unit advancing 2 hexes along the path of a retreat of a unit that retreated 2 hexes may ignore enemy zone of control. So if you're following that person. So withdrawal. Under certain circumstances, a unit or stack surrounded by enemy units and their zones of control may be moved 1 hex via withdrawal, sometimes at the cost of losing a step. An active, non-isolated unit or stack may conduct withdrawal after all combats in the activation are resolved. If all of the following are true, the withdrawing unit or stack did not move or attack in the current activation, every hex every hex adjacent to the withdrawing unit is occupied by an enemy zone of control. So every hex adjacent to the withdrawing unit is occupied by an enemy unit or zone of control. The unit slash stack is adjacent to a hex, the destination, not occupied by an enemy unit, and from which the withdrawing unit could trace supply if they were all in that hex. The destination hex may, but need not be, occupied by a friendly unit. The destination hex can be an enemy VP hex. Can't be an enemy VP hex. To withdraw an eligible unit or stack, move all the units together into the destination hex. Observe stacking limits. If the destination is not already occupied by a supplied friendly unit, remove 1 step from the withdrawing unit and stack. So we're going to go ahead and end that there. I think yesterday's video was a little too long, and I think it kind of overwhelmed some people, with me included. So today, all we talked about was movement and zone of control and withdrawal. Tomorrow, we will get into combat, and I think we'll probably just cover combat tomorrow, as that's looking like it could be pretty in depth. So until then, everybody, thanks for watching Cardboard Commander. Give us a like, do the YouTube stuff, and until next time, everybody, be safe, be kind, and happy wargaming. Talk to you later.